The day Monroe Ellsworth rode into Harlan Creek, he had not spoken more than a dozen words in 3 months, and the townspeople who watched him dismount outside the livery stable agreed among themselves that the man looked like something the high plains had already tried to bury. It was the spring of 1878, and the winter that had just ended was one that folks in the Wyoming Territory would talk about for the rest of their lives. They called it the Long Winter, though no one had agreed on that name at the time. It had simply become the name for something so terrible that it needed to be called something. Snowdrifts had reached the eaves of the tallest buildings in 3 counties. Cattle had frozen standing up in their pastures. Whole families had been found in their homesteads come the thaw, huddled together around cold hearths, still as paintings. It was the kind of winter that did not merely kill the body. It killed something inside the living, too. Monroe was 31 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have seen too much look older, not in wrinkles or gray hair, but in the stillness of the eyes. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn canvas duster, and hands that were calloused from years of ranch work. He had been a working cowboy since he was 16 years old, had ridden for 3 different outfits across Kansas and Colorado before settling into a position as foreman at the Callaway Ranch outside of Harlan Creek, Wyoming. He had been good at the work. He had been good at the life. And before the long winter, he had been known throughout the valley as a man who would sing while he worked. That was the thing people remembered most about Monroe Ellsworth, the thing that made him different from the other rough-edged men who populated the cattle country of Wyoming. He could sing. Not in the polished way of a parlor performer or a church soloist, but in the deep, natural, unself-conscious way of a man who had music inside him the same way he had blood. He sang while he mended fences. He sang riding night watch around the herd. He sang old ballads that nobody knew the origins of, and hymns with the words half wrong and trail songs that he made up himself as he rode. His voice carried across the open land the way a hawk's cry does, clear and resonant, and somehow larger than the man it came from. The other cowboys on the Callaway spread had teased him about it at first, the way men tease each other about anything that resembles softness, and then they had stopped teasing because the singing had become something they looked forward to. On long drives, when the work was grinding and the mood was low, Monroe's voice coming up from somewhere along the line of cattle was the thing that kept them going. That had been before the long winter. In November of 1877, the first blizzard had come 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Monroe had been out on the range with 2 other hands, a young man named Davy Polk, who was 19 years old and had only signed on that autumn, and an older Mexican cowboy named Santos Reyes, who had been with Callaway longer than Monroe himself. They had been trying to push the last of the cattle down from the higher grazing ground before the storm hit. The storm hit anyway. For 4 days they were pinned in a shallow gully with the horses and what cattle they could hold together, and when the weather broke enough to move, Davy Polk did not move with them. He had given his extra blanket to Monroe on the second night because Monroe's had been soaked through crossing a creek earlier in the day, and by the 4th morning the boy was gone. Santos had carried him the 2 miles back to the ranch on horseback, draped across his saddle like something unbearably light for something that had once been a living, laughing young man. Monroe had blamed himself in the particular savage way that strong men blame themselves for things they could not have controlled completely, and without mercy, and in silence. He had wrapped the grief and the guilt up together and put them somewhere inside himself that he never opened. And with them, without realizing it was happening until it was already done, he had put the singing. The long winter lasted through February. 3 more of Callaway's hands were lost to the cold in various ways over those months, and the old rancher himself took a lung sickness in January that he never fully recovered from. By the time the first real thaw came in late March, the Callaway outfit was a shadow of what it had been, and Monroe had quit not out of disloyalty, but because staying on that land with those memories felt like standing in the burned ruins of a house and calling it home. He had ridden north with no particular destination, and somehow, in the way that drifting men sometimes find themselves exactly where they need to be without knowing why, he had ended up in Harlan Creek. The town was not large. It had a main street with perhaps 20 buildings along it, a general store, a land office, a bank that was newer than everything else, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, a church, a small hotel called the Pioneer House, and a scattering of other establishments that served the ranching community spread across the surrounding valley. There was a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, run by a fastidious man named Gerald Prout who wore the same brown vest every day and considered himself the most important person in town, which he may have been. And there was a restaurant. The restaurant had no proper sign above the door. Someone had painted the words "Good Food" on the window in flaking white letters, and that was the entirety of its advertising. But every table was full at mealtime, and there was always a smell coming out of the place that made even men who were not hungry reconsider their position. The restaurant was owned and operated by a woman named Ellen Brooks. Monroe did not meet Ellen the first day he was in town. He put his horse up at the livery, arranged a room at the Pioneer House, and spent the first evening sitting in one of the saloons nursing a single glass of whiskey and not talking to anyone. He was not unfriendly when spoken to. He simply did not invite conversation, and the particular quality of his quiet not sullen, not dangerous, just closed, like a door that was not locked but would not be pushed open, communicated itself clearly enough that the men who were regulars at the Broken Spur Saloon mostly left him alone. He ate breakfast the next morning at the restaurant. The place was already busy when he arrived, with ranchers and working men seated at the 4 long tables, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread and frying bacon was so powerful and so good that Monroe stood in the doorway for a moment just breathing it in. A young Mexican girl of about 15 named Pillar moved between the tables pouring coffee and collecting empty plates. At the back of the room, visible through the pass-through window to the kitchen, was a woman working over the stove with the focused, efficient authority of someone who had been doing this particular thing for a long time and was very good at it. Monroe found a seat at the end of one of the tables, and Pillar brought him coffee without being asked, which he appreciated. He was reading the week-old newspaper that someone had left on the table when the woman from the kitchen came out carrying 2 heavy plates in each hand with a practiced grip, and set them in front of the men at the other table without spilling a drop of anything. She was 27 years old, and she was the kind of woman that men noticed not because she made any effort to be noticed, but because there was something about her that simply demanded attention, a quality of presence, of being entirely and completely herself in whatever space she occupied, that made the air around her feel more alive. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled back at the nape of her neck in a practical arrangement that had shed a few curls loose around her temples from the heat of the kitchen. Her eyes were a particular shade of brown that was almost amber in the morning light, coming through the restaurant's front window. She wore a plain gray dress with a white apron over it, and there was a small flour smudge on her left cheekbone that she appeared to be entirely unaware of. Monroe was not looking for anything. He had put that part of himself away too, somewhere next to the singing. He looked up from his newspaper because she walked past his end of the table, and then he looked back down. "What will you have?" she asked. Her voice was direct, not unfriendly but efficient. The voice of a woman who was running a busy morning and did not have time for unnecessary words. "Whatever is ready," Monroe said. "Eggs if you have them. Anything else you think is worth eating." Something shifted very slightly in her expression, as though she had expected something different from him. Most men, her expression suggested, had opinions about what they wanted and were not shy about stating them. "I have eggs," Salt pork, biscuits, and fried potatoes, she said. The potatoes are better than the salt pork today, but most men ask for the pork anyway. I will take the potatoes, Monroe said. And the biscuits. She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and Monroe went back to his newspaper, and that was the whole of their first meeting. It was not romantic. It did not feel significant in the moment. But Monroe noticed, as he ate his breakfast, which was as good as the smell had promised, maybe better, that the restaurant felt like the most comfortable place he had been in since November, and he thought that probably had something to do with the woman who ran it. He went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the fourth day, Ellen Brooks stopped asking him what he wanted and simply brought him the potatoes and the biscuits and whatever else she thought was good that morning, and Monroe ate it without comment, which was apparently the correct response because she started bringing him the better cuts of whatever she was serving. On the sixth morning, a Friday, he came in slightly later than usual because he had been up talking to a rancher named Holt Deering about the possibility of taking on some work. The restaurant was quieter, the rush of the early morning crowd already gone, and when Ellen brought his coffee, she did not immediately go back to the kitchen. She stood at the end of the table and looked at him with a directness that was not rude but was entirely without pretense. "You are looking for work," she said. He looked up. "News travels. Holt Deering eats breakfast here every morning," she said. "He mentioned he was talking to a new man about taking on a few weeks of work before the spring roundup." "That would be you, I imagine." "That would be me," Monroe agreed. "Monroe Ellsworth," she said, not a question. She had learned his name from somewhere. "I am Ellen Brooks." "I know," he said, which was true. He had learned her name the same way she had learned his, from the ambient information that circulated through a small town without anyone particularly trying to spread it. "Do you plan to stay in Harlan Creek?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to intend it. "I do not have a plan," he said finally. Ellen Brooks looked at him for another moment, and something in her expression was not quite sympathy. She was not a woman who dispensed sympathy easily or without reason, but it was a kind of recognition. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and went back to her kitchen. Monroe sat with his coffee and thought that she was the most straightforward person he had met in months, and felt, for the first time since November, something that was not quite warmth but was in the direction of it. He took the work with Holt Deering and spent the next 3 weeks riding the range and mending fence, and doing the necessary work of a ranch coming back to life after a hard winter. He was good at it. His hands remembered what to do even when his head was somewhere else. He ate dinner most evenings at Ellen's restaurant, because the food was worth it, and because the alternative was the saloon, and he had already established that he did not particularly want to spend his evenings there. He ate alone most evenings. Sometimes Ellen sat across from him when the dinner rush had settled and had a cup of coffee herself, and they talked. Not about anything important at first, the state of the range, the price of beef, the comings and goings of Harlan Creek. But gradually, over many evenings and many cups of coffee, the conversation went deeper. She had come to Wyoming 4 years ago, she told him, from Ohio. Her husband had brought her. His name had been Thomas Brooks, and he had been a good man with large ambitions and a tendency to believe that the next thing would be the thing that finally worked. He had tried farming and then a small freighting operation, and then the restaurant, which had actually been working, was actually doing well. When he had gone out one evening in the spring of 1876 to help a neighbor whose wagon had broken down on the road and had been thrown from his horse on the way back in the dark and had not gotten up again. He had been 32 years old. They had been married for 6 years. They had no children, which was a grief Ellen carried in a place separate from the grief of losing Thomas, though the two sorrows were not entirely separate either. She told Monroe these things over the course of several evenings, not all at once, not with any air of unburdening herself, but in the matter-of-fact way that she seemed to do everything, as information that was relevant to who she was and therefore relevant to any honest acquaintance. Monroe listened without interrupting or offering comfort she had not asked for, which was, he gathered from her expression, the right thing to do. In return, he told her about the Callaway Ranch, about Santos Reyes and Davy Polk, about the long winter. Not all of it at once and not easily, but she was patient without being pressuring, and the words came out over time the way water comes out of frozen ground in a slow thaw, not all at once, but steadily, and with a sense that more was being released than what was visible on the surface. He did not tell her about the singing. He was not sure why. It seemed too personal somehow, more personal than the grief itself. The grief he could describe because it had happened to him. The singing felt like something that had been him, and its absence felt like an absence of self that he was not ready to name out loud. 3 weeks into his work for Holt Deering, on an evening in late April when the air was finally genuinely warm for the first time in what felt like forever, Monroe came into the restaurant for dinner and found Ellen standing behind the counter with an expression on her face that was composed but tight around the edges. "What is wrong?" he said, because he had learned to read her face the way you learn to read weather when your life depends on it, and something was clearly wrong. She looked at him for a moment as if deciding whether to answer, and then said, "A man came in today. His name is Walter Crane. He has bought up 3 parcels of land to the north and east of town, and he wants to buy this building." Monroe sat down at the counter. "You do not want to sell." "I built this restaurant," Ellen said quietly. "Thomas and I built it together, and I have kept it running for 2 years on my own. It is mine. It is the only thing that is entirely mine." She paused. Crane is not taking no for an answer gracefully. "What does that mean?" "It means he sent a man to eat here today, who spent 2 hours at a table, making comments loud enough for the other customers to hear about the quality of the food and the cleanliness of the kitchen." Her voice was steady, but her hands, Monroe noticed, were gripping the edge of the counter. "It means he intends to make trouble until I agree to sell." Monroe was quiet for a moment. He thought about Walter Crane, whom he had heard mentioned once or twice in his weeks in Harlan Creek, a man from back east who had come to Wyoming with money, and the conviction that money entitled him to whatever he wanted. He was not the first man of that type to show up in cattle country, and he was not the last, and the damage such men did was real and lasting. "Have you spoken to Sheriff Aldridge?" Monroe asked. "Aldridge is a decent man," Ellen said, "but a man making rude comments in a restaurant is not something he can arrest anyone for." She looked at Monroe directly. "I am not asking you to do anything. I am simply telling you because you asked." "I know," Monroe said, "but I am going to come in for breakfast and dinner every day, and if any man sits at one of your tables and makes trouble, I will be here." Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, and not weakness, because she was not a woman who leaned into weakness. It was more like the recognition of an alliance, the acknowledgement that someone was standing on the same side of something as she was. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I eat here anyway," Monroe said. "It is not a sacrifice." She looked at him for another moment, and then something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood crossed her face. "The potatoes are very good tonight," she said, and went back to her kitchen. Over the next 2 weeks, Monroe was in the restaurant every morning and every evening. 3 times, men came in who had clearly been sent by Walter Crane. It was obvious enough from the way they came in together and sat at prominent tables, and began muttering commentary just loud enough to carry. Twice, Monroe simply stood up from where he was sitting and moved to a table directly adjacent to them, and looked at them with the particular calm, unwavering attention of a man who has spent years managing unpredictable animals and unruly cowboys, and both times the men finished their coffee in sudden silence and left. The 3rd time, one of the men said something about the food that was audible enough to cause one of the regular customers to look up with a frown, and Monroe said, quietly but clearly enough for the whole room to hear, "The food in this restaurant is the best I have eaten in the Wyoming Territory, and I have been in the Wyoming Territory for 15 years. If you find it wanting, You are welcome to take your meals elsewhere." The man looked at him and then looked away, and that was the end of that. Ellen, who had heard this from the kitchen through the pass-through window, came out afterward with a coffee pot and refilled Monroe's cup without a word, but her amber eyes were warm, and that felt like enough. Walter Crane himself came into the restaurant on the 1st of May. He was a thick-necked man in his 40s with the red face of someone who was accustomed to having his blood pressure managed by getting what he wanted, and he wore a good suit that was not quite right for Wyoming, too formal for the territory and too new for a man who belonged here. He sat down at the center table, which was the largest, and asked to speak with the proprietor. Ellen came out of the kitchen. She untied her apron and folded it over her arm, which Monroe had learned was the thing she did when she needed to be entirely herself rather than the restaurateur, and she stood across the table from Walter Crane and waited for him to speak. "Mrs. Brooks," Crane said, with a smile that had no warmth in it, "I think we can settle this matter to everyone's satisfaction. I am prepared to offer you $1,200 for this property." "This property is not for sale," Ellen said. "That is a great deal of money for a woman in your position." "My position," Ellen said, "is that of a business owner. This business is profitable and it is mine. The price of it is not relevant because it is not for sale." Crane's smile went a little harder at the edges. "I understand sentiment, Mrs. Brooks, but sentiment does not pay for repairs when the roof needs mending. Sentiment does not pay for the supplies you order from Carmichael's store every week. Things can become difficult for a business in ways that have nothing to do with the quality of the food." Monroe, who had been sitting at the end of the counter, put down his coffee cup. He did it quietly. He stood up, which also he did quietly, and he walked over to the table and stood next to Ellen, not in front of her. She did not need anyone to stand in front of her, but beside her, in the way that made clear he was with her rather than protecting her. "Mr. Crane," Monroe said, "I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Did you just suggest that Mrs. Brooks's business might encounter difficulties if she does not sell to you? Because if that is what you said, I think Sheriff Aldridge would be interested to hear it repeated. He is usually having his mid-morning coffee at the Broken Spur right now, and I would be glad to go get him." Crane looked at Monroe with the cold assessment of a man deciding whether someone is a threat. Monroe looked back with the complete, unhurried calm of a man who had already made his decisions and did not need to announce them. "I was speaking generally," Crane said finally. "I thought you might have been," Monroe said. "Mrs. Brooks has given you her answer. I expect you can find your way out." Crane stood up slowly with the deliberateness of a man who wanted to make clear he was choosing to leave rather than being removed. He put on his hat, looked at Ellen once more with something that was not quite a threat but was not far from one, and walked out of the restaurant. Ellen stood still for a moment after the door closed. Then she said, "Thank you." "He will not push it further," Monroe said. "Men like that do not want the sheriff involved. They want things quiet." "I know," Ellen said. And then, after a pause, "I could have managed him myself." "I know that too," Monroe said. "I was not trying to manage him for you. I was standing next to you." She looked at him then in a way she had not quite looked at him before, a longer look, a more searching one, as though she was seeing something she had suspected was there but had not been sure of. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy the search, because she gave a small nod and said, "Sit down. I will bring you biscuits." Something was changing between them, and they both knew it, and neither one of them said so, because they were both people who were careful with words and more careful with the things that mattered most. But the evening conversations grew longer, and the quality of the silences between them changed, became comfortable in a way that silences only become between people who are becoming important to each other. Monroe found himself thinking about her during the day, in the particular involuntary way that means something has taken up residence in a person's mind without asking permission. He found himself looking forward to the evenings in the way he had once looked forward to nothing. Ellen, for her part, began to save things during the day, small things, observations and moments and bits of news, to tell Monroe in the evenings. She noticed herself doing this and did not discourage it, because she was a practical woman and she knew what it meant. She had been careful since Thomas died, careful about hope and careful about attachment, and she was still careful, but Monroe Ellsworth was the kind of man who inspired a different kind of carefulness. Not the carefulness of protecting yourself from pain, but the carefulness of someone who has found something worth tending. On the 10th of May, Monroe finished his work for Holt Deering and was not immediately certain what to do next. He walked into the restaurant at lunchtime and sat at the counter, and told Ellen he was done with the Deering job, and Ellen looked at him with the direct gaze that he had come to understand meant she was about to say something she had been thinking about for a while. "Holt Deering is not the only rancher in this valley who needs a good hand," she said. "Bill Stratford has been coming in here for 3 weeks complaining that he cannot find anyone who knows what they are doing since the winter cleared out half his crew." Monroe looked at her. "You think I should talk to Stratford?" "I think you could," she said, "if you were planning to stay." There it was, the thing neither of them had said. Monroe was quiet for a moment, and Ellen waited in the way she waited for things, without impatience, but without pretending not to care. "I was thinking," Monroe said slowly, "that I might stay." The warmth in Ellen's eyes when he said that was a thing he wanted to look at for a long time. "Good," she said. "I will tell Bill Stratford to expect you." He took the job with Bill Stratford and moved out of the Pioneer House into the small bunkhouse on the Stratford Ranch, which was 3 miles from town. He still came into the restaurant every evening for dinner, which was not a practical requirement. Bill Stratford's cook was perfectly adequate, but had become a necessity of a different kind. The other hands on the Stratford spread noticed, because cowboys always notice these things and consider it their business, and there was some teasing of the gentle sort that Monroe bore with more patience than he might have expected of himself, because the teasing was fundamentally correct, and he no longer felt any particular need to deny it. One evening in the middle of May, there was a dance in town. The church hosted these several times a year, a practical social function in a land where the spaces between people were large, and the winters were long, and the need for community was real and urgent. Monroe cleaned up after his day's work and rode into town in his good shirt, and he stood against the wall of the church hall with a glass of punch that he was not drinking and watched Ellen Brooks come through the door, in a dress he had not seen before, not her gray restaurant dress but a blue one, the color of the sky just before dark, and with her hair slightly different from how she wore it during the day, and Monroe felt something in his chest do something he was not entirely prepared for. She found him against the wall about 10 minutes after she arrived, because it was a small hall and he was taller than most of the men in it. She stood beside him and he said, "You look very nice," which was not adequate but was what he had. "So do you," she said, and she meant it, and they both knew she meant it, and the air between them was suddenly charged in a way that made the hall feel very warm. The fiddler started up a reel and couples moved onto the floor and someone grabbed Monroe's arm. It was old Gerald Prout, surprisingly lively for a man who spent his days in a post office, and said, "Come on, Ellsworth, don't stand there like a fence post." And Monroe looked at Ellen and said, "Would you like to?" And she said, "I would," and they danced. Monroe had not danced since before the long winter either. He was not an elegant dancer, but he was sure-footed and he had a good sense of the rhythm, and Ellen was better than he was and compensated for his lapses with a natural ease that made them look well matched. They danced 2 dances together and then took a break to breathe, and stood close together at the edge of the room, closer than they needed to stand given the available space, and talked over the noise of the music and the other dancers. "I have not done this in a long time," Monroe said. "Nor have I," Ellen said. She was still slightly flushed from the dancing, and she was smiling, genuinely smiling, and it was the first time he had seen her smile like that without reservation, without the careful management she applied to most of her expressions. It transformed her face into something radiant. Monroe felt the thing in his chest again, stronger than before, and recognized it for what it was, and thought that it was perhaps the most frightening and the most welcome thing he had felt in a very long time. They walked home from the dance together. The night was clear and cold the way Wyoming nights in May still are, and the stars were exceptional, and their breath made small clouds in the air as they walked. They walked slowly, because neither of them was in a hurry to reach the restaurant where they would have to say good night. When they reached the door, they stood facing each other in the cold starlight, and Monroe said, "Ellen," and she said, "Monroe," and then neither of them said anything else for a moment because the moment was full enough already. He kissed her then, carefully and briefly, the way he did everything that mattered with complete attention and without waste. She put her hand against his chest and kissed him back, and when they separated she was looking at him with an expression that was quiet and very full, and she said, "Good night, Monroe Ellsworth." "Good night, Ellen Brooks," he said, and rode back to the Stratford ranch in the dark with the feeling of something long frozen beginning, cautiously, to thaw. The weeks that followed were the best Monroe had experienced in longer than he could accurately calculate. He worked hard during the days, which he had always done, but now the work had a tether to it, a reason to be here, in this particular place, doing these particular things. He and Ellen developed a rhythm that fit around their separate lives, like water finding a channel. Mornings he was on the range. Evenings he was at the restaurant, and there were long conversations in the quiet after the last customers had gone, and there were moments where her hand touched his across the counter and neither of them moved away. And there was laughter. He had not known how much he had missed laughing until he found himself doing it again, in the warm kitchen of Ellen's restaurant, while she said something dry and precise about one of the town's more colorful characters. One evening in late May, she asked him something that no one had asked him since November. They were sitting at the back table in the empty restaurant, the last of the dinner dishes cleared away, 2 cups of coffee between them, the oil lamp turned low. Outside, the spring evening was peaceful crickets starting up, the distant lowing of cattle somewhere, the particular wide silence of the Wyoming plains that was never entirely quiet but was a particular quality of quiet that Monroe had always loved. "I heard," Ellen said carefully, "from Bill Stratford's wife, that you used to sing." Monroe became very still. Ellen watched him. Her voice was gentle but not soft. She was not treating it as a fragile thing, because she had a good instinct about what Monroe needed and she knew he did not need to be handled. Clara Stratford said she heard it from a man who used to work for the Callaway outfit. She said you used to sing while you worked, and that it was something remarkable. "Clara Stratford talks a great deal," Monroe said, but there was no edge in it. "She does," Ellen agreed. "Is it true?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the crickets went on about their business. The lamp flame moved slightly in a breath of air from somewhere. "It was true," he said finally. "Was," Ellen said, "not a question." "I have not sung since before the long winter," he said. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you say a thing that is true and that you have been carrying a long time. "I do not know entirely why. I know that sounds strange." Ellen looked at him with her amber eyes in the lamplight and she said, "It does not sound strange at all." She was quiet for a moment. "Will you sing something now?" He looked at her. "Ellen, you do not have to," she said. "I am asking. You can say no." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Davy Polk, who had given him his blanket on that second terrible night. He thought about the months of silence, and what the silence had been for, and whether it had served any purpose beyond punishment. He thought about the last song he had sung, which had been a simple thing, just a trail ballad about a river and the way the current moves, sung to himself while riding night watch in October before the first storm came, when the world had still been the world as he knew it. He thought about Ellen Brooks in the lamplight, who had asked him as simply and directly as she did everything, and who was waiting for his answer without pressure, and who had given him in the last weeks the first real warmth he had allowed himself to feel since the winter. He began to sing. It was not a grand song. It was the one that came to him, an old hymn, the words only approximately correct because he had never known them exactly, about the river of grace and the long road home and the mercy that waits at the end of it. His voice came out rougher at first than it had ever been, like a door long unused on its hinges, and then it settled into itself, found the old pathways, found the thing that had always lived there and that had not, it turned out, been truly gone, only covered, the way the grass is covered in winter and is still there beneath the snow, waiting. Ellen sat perfectly still across the table. She did not look away from him while he sang. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup, and her expression had gone into something deep and quiet that he could not entirely read. And when he finished, the last note going up and then out into the warm evening air, she let out a slow breath. "Monroe," she said softly. He did not say anything. Something had happened in the singing, something had shifted or released, something he had not known was still clenched had unclenched, and he felt it the way you feel the blood returning to a limb that has been asleep, sharp and strange and alive. "That was," she started and then stopped and started again. "Thank you for that. I did not know," he said, "if it was still there." "It was still there," she said. Her eyes were bright. "It was always still there." He looked at her across the low-lit table, this woman who had fed him and spoken plainly to him and stood beside him and asked him for this one thing that had turned out to be the right thing. And he felt something come back into himself that he had thought was gone, not just the singing, but the thing the singing had always been a symptom of, the capacity for joy, for connection, for the full-throated engagement with being alive that he had been keeping himself away from since November. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he did things, without preamble, without softening it into something safer, just the truth of it, clear and direct. She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were very bright, and she said, "I love you too, Monroe Ellsworth. I have for some time." He stood up from the table, and she stood up from the table, and he crossed the small space between them, and took her face in his calloused hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back with a completeness and a warmth that undid him entirely. And they stood in her empty restaurant in the lamplight in the Wyoming spring and held each other. And outside the crickets kept singing as though the world were the simplest and most ordinary place, which it was and was not, which it always is and never is. That summer was the finest summer Monroe had known in Wyoming, which was saying something because he had known some good ones. He and Ellen were together in the open way of people who have made their feelings clear and have no interest in pretending otherwise, which in a town as small as Harlan Creek meant that the whole of the community knew within approximately 3 days and had opinions about it, most of which were favorable. Clara Stratford was delighted. Bill Stratford shook Monroe's hand. Gerald Pruitt at the post office managed a congratulatory nod. Even the regulars at the Broken Spur Saloon, who had watched Monroe arrive in town like a closed book and gradually become something else entirely, gave him the respect due a man who had found something worth staying for. Walter Crane did not trouble Ellen again. Whether it was the conversation in the restaurant or the general knowledge that Monroe Ellsworth was a man with something to protect and the evident intention of protecting it, or simply the fact that Crane moved his ambitions northward toward more tractable targets, he stopped sending men to sit in her restaurant and left her alone. Ellen received this development with satisfaction and without gloating, which was her way. Monroe sang again after that evening. Not every day, not with the same unself-conscious frequency as before the long winter, but enough. He sang while he rode the Stratford Range in the mornings, and sometimes the other hands heard it and were quiet in the way people are quiet when they hear something that is more than the sum of its parts. He sang in the evenings in Ellen's kitchen when the restaurant was closed, simple things and complex things, and she listened while she finished the tasks of the day, and sometimes she hummed along to things she knew. Once, sitting on the steps of her restaurant on a warm July evening, he sang to her directly, a song he had written himself the way he had always made up songs, loosely, following where the tune led, and it was about a woman with amber eyes and flower on her cheek, and the way a restaurant could be the first place a man had felt at home in longer than he could remember, and she laughed at the flower part and was quiet about the rest of it, but she took his hand and held it. And that was its own kind of harmony. He proposed to her in August, which some people in town thought was quick and some thought was slow, and which Monroe thought was exactly right because by August he was as certain as he had ever been of anything. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon when the restaurant was closed and they were walking along the creek that ran behind the town, and she was wearing her blue dress again, and the light was the particular amber gold of late summer in Wyoming. He stopped walking and she stopped with him because she read him well enough by then to know when something was coming. "I want to marry you, Ellen," he said. "I want to be your husband. I want to build something with you here in this place. That is what I want, and I will wait as long as you need me to, but I wanted you to know it plainly." Ellen looked at him with those amber eyes that he had been reading for months now, and what was in them was clear and warm and utterly unambiguous. "I do not need time," she said. "The answer is yes." He pulled her close, and she put her hands against his chest, and they stood by the creek in the August gold and held each other, and the water went on its easy way over the stones, and somewhere above them a hawk turned lazy circles in the enormous Wyoming sky. They were married in October, in the little church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday when the aspens had turned gold and the air was cold and bright, and the whole of the town turned out because there was a genuine feeling abroad that something good was happening. Ellen wore her blue dress altered slightly for the occasion, and Monroe wore his good clothes brushed clean and mended, and Gerald Prout blew his nose noisily at the back of the church and pretended he had a cold. Santos Reyes rode up from the south for the wedding, because Monroe had written to him, and the two men embraced in the churchyard before the ceremony in the undemonstrative way of men who have been through terrible things together. Santos had weathered the long winter at a different outfit and was doing well enough, and he shook Ellen's hand and told her, in his straightforward way, that Monroe Ellsworth was the best man he had ever worked beside, and she said she was aware of that, and Santos laughed and said he thought she would be. The minister said the words, and Monroe and Ellen said theirs, and when Monroe kissed his bride, the collected citizens of Harlan Creek made a noise of collective approval that the minister pretended was dignified, and that was actually deeply happy. And Monroe Ellsworth, who had not thought he would find his way back to himself, felt entirely and completely found. After the wedding, they had a proper celebration in Ellen's restaurant, which was the largest indoor space in town, and which she had closed for the day and opened for the party. Tables were pushed aside, and Hezekiah Foote, who played fiddle better than anyone else in 3 counties, played until his arm gave out, and people danced and ate the prodigious food that Ellen and Pillar had been preparing for 2 days, and there was good whiskey and good cider and general good feeling. Monroe danced with his wife 3 times and stood watching her the rest of the evening with the unguarded expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and has no intention of pretending otherwise. Ellen, for her part, looked across the room at him often in the way she had of looking direct and warm and entirely present, and the looks between them had the quality of a private conversation happening inside the public celebration. Late in the evening, when the fiddle had paused and the dancing had slowed and people were sitting in comfortable clusters talking and drinking, Hezekiah Foote said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "All right, Ellsworth. I heard you can sing. Let us hear it." There was a murmur of interest around the room. Monroe looked at Ellen, who was standing beside him with his hand in hers. She raised her eyebrows slightly, the expression she used when she was leaving a decision entirely to him. He looked around the room at the faces of the people of Harlan Creek, the ranchers and the shopkeepers and the cowboys and the few women who had made their lives here in this hard and beautiful country, and he thought that this was his community now, these were his people, and this woman beside him was his home. He began to sing. He sang an old song about a long road and the place at the end of it, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something real is happening in them. Hezekiah Foote picked up the tune after a moment and followed him on the fiddle, soft and underneath. And Monroe's voice went up into the rafters of Ellen's restaurant and out through the windows into the October night. And people sat still and listened, and some of them felt things they had not expected to feel at a wedding party, and some of them did not have words for what they felt, which was fine because some things are for feeling and not for saying. Ellen held his hand through the whole song and looked up at him, and her eyes were bright and full, and when he finished the room was quiet for one long moment, and then filled with the warm noise of people who have been genuinely moved. Winter came again to Harlan Creek, as it always did, as it always will. But this winter was not the long winter. The snow came at the right time and in the right amounts, and the cattle were well prepared and well tended, and the town was warm with fire and community, and the ordinary miraculous business of people living their lives together. Monroe moved into the rooms above Ellen's restaurant, which was where she lived, 3 rooms that she had made into a home with the practical care she brought to everything. And the restaurant below them was the sound and smell of their daily life, bread baking in the mornings, coffee always, the rhythms of a well-run enterprise that was now also his enterprise, his home, his world. He helped her in the mornings before he rode out to the Stratford ranch, bringing in wood and hauling water, and doing the heavy work that she had been doing herself, and she packed his lunch without being asked because she was up before him anyway to start the baking, and these small mutual acts of care accumulated over the winter into something solid and sustaining. They talked in the evenings the way they always had, about everything and nothing, and the conversations were different now, fuller, because there was no longer anything they were being careful about, nothing they were approaching gradually. They knew each other, and that knowledge was a pleasure neither of them took for granted. In December, Monroe rode up into the hills east of town on a Saturday and came back with a Christmas tree, which he had to wrestle up the stairs to the living quarters above the restaurant in a process that involved considerable cursing and some laughter. Ellen decorated it with things she had saved, a few glass ornaments that had survived the journey from Ohio wrapped in her mother's old letters, some ribbons, and paper stars that Pillar had helped her make. And on Christmas Eve they sat by the small stove and Monroe sang carols, the words only approximately right, the sound entirely beautiful, and Ellen leaned against him and watched the lamplight play on the Christmas tree's branches and thought she had not felt such simple and complete happiness in years. Spring came back to the valley in its own good time. The aspens leafed out and the creek ran fast with snowmelt, and the cattle on the ranges grew sleek again, and Monroe rode out each morning into a world that was coming back to itself, which mirrored something he felt in his own chest, not a return to what was before, because nothing returns exactly to what it was, but a renewal, a new version of a thing that had been there all along. Ellen was 3 months along by the time the first aspens budded, and she told Monroe on a Tuesday morning before the breakfast rush when they were the only 2 people in the restaurant, and she said it in her direct, unembroidered way. "I am going to have a baby. The doctor thinks November." Monroe set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at his wife across the counter. He felt the thing in his chest again, the thing he had first felt looking at her in the lamplight across an empty restaurant when she asked him to sing, but larger now, more overwhelming, like the difference between a creek in summer and a river in the thaw. "Ellen," he said. "I know," she said, which was not quite an answer to what he had not yet said, but was exactly right anyway. He went around the counter and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look, which was something she did not do with many people, let herself be seen. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but well. The doctor says everything looks fine." He kissed her forehead and held her carefully, and she put her arms around him and they stood in the empty restaurant in the spring morning, and Monroe thought of Davy Polk, who had given him his blanket on a freezing night and had never known what would come after, what good would come after. He thought that the debt to Davy was something that could not be paid, and something that could only be honored by living fully, by not wasting the warmth that had been preserved. "Thank you," he said quietly, though it was an odd thing to say and he was not entirely sure what he meant by it. "Thank you to Ellen. Thank you to whatever arranged these things. Thank you to the fact that he had ended up in Harlan Creek, that she had brought him coffee, that she had asked him to sing on a May evening when the lamplight was low." "You are thanking me for being with child," Ellen said, and there was a glimmer of amusement in her voice. "I am thanking you for everything," he said. "All of it." She held him tighter and said, "Everything," in a voice that was quiet and full. The months of the pregnancy moved through the summer and into the fall, and Monroe was attentive in the way that was his nature, not hovering or anxious, but present, noticing, quietly making things easier without making a performance of it. He took over the heavier work in the restaurant entirely, and he convinced Bill Stratford to let him move to part-time work through the final months so he could be in town more. And Stratford agreed because he was a fair man, and because Monroe Ellsworth was worth accommodating. Ellen ran the restaurant through all of it, because the restaurant was her life's work, and she was not a woman who surrendered her work to a condition. But she trained Pillar more extensively during those months and hired a second helper, a young widow named Martha Gaines who had come to Harlan Creek from Colorado and needed steady employment. By September, the restaurant could run a full morning service with Ellen only supervising from a chair if she needed to, which she mostly did not need to because she was sturdy and healthy, and annoyed with anyone who suggested otherwise. Monroe worried anyway, in the private way he had of worrying, not outwardly, not in a way that burdened her, but genuinely and deeply, because he was capable of loving a thing so much that the fear of losing it was always close by. He had learned in the last year to let the fear inform his care without letting it overwhelm the love, and that was a kind of growth he was quietly proud of. Their son was born on the 4th of November, 1879, in the rooms above the restaurant, delivered by Dr. Hargrove with the assistance of Clara Stratford, who had insisted on being there and who was, it turned out, considerably helpful. Monroe was not permitted in the room during the labor, which was the custom of the time, and he spent 3 hours sitting at the counter in the empty restaurant below in the dark, and would have been perfectly still except that he could not quite manage it, and so he was not perfectly still. He sang, quietly to himself and to no one, the same hymn he had sung for Ellen in the lamplight in May, about the river of grace and the long road home. He sang it through twice and then sat quietly, and then Dr. Hargrove's voice came from upstairs, and then a baby's voice, and Monroe stood up so fast that he knocked his chair over. He was a boy, red and furious and beautiful in the way that newborns are beautiful, which is a beauty not of prettiness but of pure aliveness. Ellen held him against her chest and was exhausted and radiant, and when Monroe came into the room and sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, he felt something so large and so entire that there were not words available to him, and he did not try to find them. "He needs a name," Ellen said. Her voice was tired and warm. Monroe looked at the small, fierce face of his son. "David," he said. "I would like to call him David." Ellen looked at him. She knew about Davy Polk. He had told her the whole story over the winter quietly on one of the long evenings. She understood what the name was for. "David Ellsworth," she said. "Yes, that is a good name." Monroe put his finger against the baby's small fist, and the small fist closed around it with a grip that was astonishing in its determination, and Monroe Ellsworth, who had once thought that something essential in himself was gone beyond recovery, felt it, whole, present, returned, and knew it was not going anywhere again. David Ellsworth was a vociferous and opinionated baby from his first moments, and did not much moderate as the months went on. He had Monroe's dark hair and Ellen's amber eyes, and a personality that seemed to be an amalgamation of the most insistent qualities of both his parents, which was simultaneously exhausting and profoundly entertaining. He cried loudly when displeased, and was happy with a completeness that filled whatever room he was in, and he appeared to find the restaurant fascinating from the earliest age. He could hold his head up to look around, following the movement of people and plates with the concentrated attention of someone intending to make a thorough study. Monroe sang to him. He sang the hymn and the trail songs and the ballad about the river, and he made up new ones about a boy with amber eyes and a very firm opinion about breakfast. And David listened with an expression of critical evaluation that was very like his mother's and fell asleep occasionally mid-song, which Monroe took as the highest possible endorsement. Santos Reyes rode up from the south again in the spring of 1880 to see the child, and sat at the counter of the restaurant holding David with the careful, wondering expression of a tough man in the presence of new life, and told Monroe in Spanish and in English that this was a good thing, all of this. And Monroe said he knew, and Santos said, "You look like yourself again." And Monroe said, "I am myself again." And Santos nodded once, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Ellen watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and felt the complicated warmth of a woman who loves a man well enough to love the things that made him. The restaurant prospered as the years settled in. Ellen's instinct for what people wanted and her absolute refusal to do anything at less than her best had built her a reputation that extended well beyond Harlan Creek cattlemen. Coming through the territory made the town a specific stopping point because of the food, which was the kind of compliment that has actual monetary value. She expanded the dining room in 1880, knocking through to an adjacent space that had been a storage room, and hired Martha Gaines full-time and eventually Pillar full-time as well. And the operation that had once been one woman with flour on her cheek managing everything herself became a properly staffed establishment that was still, unmistakably, entirely hers in character and quality. Monroe moved from the Stratford Ranch to a piece of land of his own 8 acres along the creek east of town that he bought in the spring of 1880 with money he had been saving since he first came to Wyoming, and which now, with an income from the restaurant, he was able to add to until it was enough. It was not a big spread, but it was his, and he ran a small horse operation there, breeding and training working horses for the ranches in the valley, which was work he was exceptionally good at, and which satisfied him in a different way than range work had. He could do more of it close to home, which mattered to him now in ways it had not mattered before. He built a proper house on the land in the summer of 1880, with help from Bill Stratford and 3 of the hands in Santos Reyes, who rode up again for the purpose and stayed 2 weeks and was fed magnificently for his trouble. It was a solid, honest house, not large but well built, with a proper kitchen and a parlor and 2 bedrooms and a porch that looked out across the creek toward the aspens on the far bank. Ellen chose the curtains and Monroe installed them incorrectly 3 times before she took over, and this process was instructive for both of them in different ways. They moved into the house in September, and Ellen kept the restaurant going with Pillar and Martha managing the daily operations, coming in herself for the peak hours and for the cooking that only she knew how to do. The arrangement suited everyone. Ellen kept her business, Monroe had his land, and they had a home that was both of theirs, built together and lived in together, with a son who grew steadily into a person of very specific and strongly held preferences. In December of 1881, Ellen told Monroe over breakfast at the kitchen table in their house that David was going to be a brother. Monroe, who had been pouring coffee, set the coffee pot down with extraordinary care and looked at his wife across the table, and she looked back with her amber eyes full of warmth and a private smile. "November again," he said. "The doctor thinks October this time," she said. Monroe went around the table and kissed her, and David, who was sitting in his chair watching this development with the analytical attention he brought to everything, said, "What?" in a clear and demanding tone, which was one of the few words he had so far mastered and which he applied broadly. "We are going to have company," Monroe told him. David considered this information and appeared to withhold judgment, which was consistent with his general approach to new situations. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1882 in the house by the creek, and she was different from David in the way that children from the same parents are sometimes entirely different, quieter from the beginning, with a particular concentrated stillness that her parents would come to know as the prelude to strong and carefully considered opinions. They named her Clara, for Clara Stratford, who had been at David's birth, and who wept openly at the news of the name, and brought the baby an enormous and impractical quantity of preserved fruit as a gift, which was characteristic. Clara Ellsworth grew up with her father's music and her mother's steady directness, and her own particular combination of the two that was neither, but was entirely herself. She was the one who eventually learned to carry a tune properly, which Monroe discovered when she was about 3 years old, and began to sing along with him at bedtime in a clear, small voice that hit the notes with a precision that was both surprising and deeply satisfying. David, by contrast, could not carry a tune to save his life and knew it and minded it not at all, which was perhaps his father's influence in a different form. The comfort with oneself, with what one is and is not, that Monroe had come back to in the year after the long winter. The winters that followed were hard but survivable, which is the best that Wyoming winters usually manage, and Monroe Ellsworth came to know them differently than he had, not with dread, but with the respect due a genuine adversary that you are prepared for. He laid in enough wood and enough supplies and enough of everything that mattered, and the house was warm, and the evenings were long and lit by lamplight, and full of conversation and sometimes cards, and sometimes reading aloud, and always, somewhere in the evening, singing. He sang for his children the way he had once sung only for himself, and then for no one, and then for Ellen on a May evening when something came back that he had thought was gone. He sang the hymns and the trail songs and the ballads he had known since boyhood, and the ones he had made up along the way, and some new ones that the years gave him. About a woman who made the best biscuits in Wyoming, and was braver than anyone he had ever known. About a boy who could not carry a tune but could ride a horse by age 4 with a confidence that was almost alarming. About a girl who sang the high notes that her father missed. Ellen listened to the singing with the expression she had worn on that first evening, quiet and full, not quite able to contain how much was in it. She never stopped asking him to sing when the evenings were right for it, and he never stopped being moved that she asked, because her asking had been the thing that began it. The gentle, direct, entirely characteristic request that had reached into the frozen place where he had put himself and brought him back out into the warmth. He told her this once plainly, on a winter evening when the children were in bed and the fire was low, and the house was the particular quiet that means everyone you love is safe inside it. He told her that it had been her asking that had done it, that he did not think he would have found his way back without her. She was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire, and then she said, "You would have found your way. You are that kind of man." "Maybe," he said, "but it would have taken longer, and I would have been alone while I was finding it." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the fire in the house he had built for her on the land he had chosen to stay for, in the town he had drifted into at the end of the worst winter of his life. And outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and brilliant with stars, and inside was entirely warm. Harlan Creek grew in the years that followed, the way small western towns grew in that era, not always gracefully, not always justly, but persistently, with the peculiar tenacity of places that have reason to exist. The railroad pushed through 30 miles to the south in 1883, which changed things economically and brought new people and new complications. And there were arguments about land and water rights that Monroe was occasionally involved in on the side of fair dealing. And there were new families arriving who needed to be helped through the first hard winters. And there were disputes settled in various ways, some better than others. that were the ongoing business of a community making itself. Monroe was a man of standing in Harlan Creek by the mid-1880s, not through any position he sought, but through the simple accumulation of years of honest dealing and fair judgment that causes certain people to become who other people bring their problems to. He sat on the town council eventually, not eagerly but conscientiously, because someone had to and he could do it without being corrupted by it, which was not nothing. Ellen's restaurant remained the best food in 3 counties and became in some ways the social center of Harlan Creek, the place where things were decided and announced and celebrated and mourned, which is what good restaurants always become in communities that have them. She trained Pillar thoroughly enough that Pillar could have run it alone, and eventually Pillar did, increasingly, as Ellen's attentions were divided, and as her own children grew and needed different kinds of her time and energy. But Ellen never stopped cooking the things that were specifically hers to cook, never stopped being present in the place she had built. Walter Crane reappeared briefly in 1885, attempting to acquire land in the eastern part of the valley, and ran into the kind of organized community resistance that he had not encountered in his earlier visit, when Harlan Creek had been less organized, and its residents less practiced at being a community. Monroe and Bill Stratford and several others met with him in a manner that was courteous and entirely unmistakable in its resolution, and Crane moved his ambitions elsewhere without significant incident, and that was the end of that. Santos Reyes settled in the valley in 1884, having gotten tired of drifting, and Monroe helped him find a small piece of land and establish himself as a horse trainer, which was work Santos was excellent at and which Monroe's own operation could not quite handle alone as it grew. They worked together in the easy way of men who have been through something together and trust each other absolutely, and their professional partnership was the kind that made both of their enterprises better than either could have been separately. The summers were long and generous in those years, the winters severe but manageable, and the children grew in the way that children grow, quickly, and in directions that cannot be entirely predicted. David Ellsworth at 8 was a serious, determined boy who loved horses with a focus that rivaled his father's, and who had his mother's way of looking at a problem from all angles before acting. Clara at 6 was the songbird that her father sometimes called her, with a clear voice that got clearer as she grew, and a personality that combined Monroe's warmth with Ellen's precision in a way that was entirely her own. There were difficult things in those years too, as there always are. The territory's relationship with the Arapaho and Shoshone peoples to the north and west was troubled and unjust in ways that Monroe saw and spoke about when speaking about it meant something. And the treatment of the Chinese workers who had helped build the railroad and who remained in the territory under difficult circumstances troubled him in ways that he expressed concretely when he could, and felt the inadequacy of good intentions in ways that he did not dismiss. The West was beautiful and it was brutal, and both of those things were true at once, and he was a man who did not look away from either. He told his children about the long winter in time, when they were old enough to understand it, not to burden them with it, but to give them the truth of where their father had been and how he had come back from it, because he believed that the truth of difficult things was part of what children needed to grow up honest. He told them about Davy Polk and why their older brother had that name, and David received this knowledge with the gravity it deserved, and Clara sat very still in the way she did with important things. He told them that a person can lose something and find it again, that cold things can thaw, that the road home is sometimes long but is usually there. He told them this in the particular way he told things, plainly, without embroidery, with the conviction of someone who knows it because they lived it. Ellen listened from the kitchen doorway while he told them, not for the first time but always as though for the first time, because there are things you can hear again and again and still be moved by, and this was one of them. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, In October of 1888, Monroe and Ellen sat on the porch of their house by the creek and watched the aspens turning gold on the far bank, the same gold they had turned on the October afternoon when he had proposed to her by the water. The children were inside, David helping Clara with her letters at the kitchen table in the lamplight that fell through the window onto the porch. Ellen leaned against Monroe's shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the gold aspens and the wide sky above them going slowly from blue to the deep violet that comes just before the stars. "Sing something," she said. He smiled. She could feel it in the movement of his shoulder, the slight change in his breathing. He always smiled when she asked, not because it had ever been a burden, not now, not for a long time, but because she always asked, and that still meant everything. He began to sing. The hymn first, the one about the river and the long road, the one that had been the first thing he had sung for her in the lamplight of the restaurant all those years ago. Then something slower, something new, a song about aspens turning gold in October, and the particular amber of a woman's eyes in the autumn light, and the way a house feels when everyone you love is inside it. Ellen listened with her eyes half closed, leaning against him, feeling the vibration of his voice in his chest where her head rested, watching the aspens lose their leaves one by one in the still evening air. Inside, she could hear David's voice saying something to Clara, and Clara's answering, and the domestic music of her children doing ordinary things was wound into Monroe's singing like a harmony. The stars came out, one at a time and then all at once, the way they do in Wyoming, and the song went up into the enormous dark above the valley, and everything, the voice, the stars, the gold aspens, the lamplight through the window, the man beside her and the children inside and the years of it, all of it felt like the answer to a question that she had not known she was asking when a quiet man with empty eyes had sat down at the end of her long table one morning and asked for whatever was ready. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and he covered her hand with his other hand, and they sat like that in the cooling evening with his song moving out across the creek and the aspens and the long Wyoming dark, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Inside, David said something that made Clara laugh, a clear, bright sound that came through the window and mixed with the song and the aspens and the stars, and Monroe paused in his singing for a moment and listened to his daughter's laughter, and then he smiled fully, completely, without reservation, and started the song again from the beginning and sang it all the way through. The long winter was over. It had been over for 10 years. What had come after it was this house, this woman, this song, these children, these stars. What had come after the worst thing was the best thing, which is not always how it goes, but is how it went for Monroe Ellsworth of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, who had thought something in him was gone and had been asked by the right person at the right moment to find that it was not gone at all. It was here. It had always been here. Waiting like grass under snow for the right season to come back to the light.